Hey everybody, welcome back to Agreement of Purchase and Sale Part 2. Today we're just going to continue on to the APS Form 100, Clauses 15, working our way down. So let's get started. Clause 15, what does it mean? The Planning Act. So this clause ensures that the property is going to be sold in compliance with the Ontario Land Division laws. If the property has been divided, for example, through severance or subdivision, it must meet specific legal requirements. If it doesn't comply, the sale can't legally close until the issues are resolved. This is especially important for properties that are being part of a bigger land development. So before proceeding, it's crucial to confirm that the land is compliant with zoning and development rules in that area. Working on down. Next, we have Clause 16, Document Preparation. This clause section specifies who's responsible for covering the closing costs of each side, so in preparing the legal documents, and it just makes everything smooth at closing. So the sellers usually is going to pay for the transfer deed of the land, the document that transfers ownership, and prepares the land transfer tax affidavit. So, however, the buyer is responsible for paying the actual land transfer tax payment itself, which will be a percentage of the purchase price. And in Toronto, that's usually double. Buyers are going to be covering the cost of the mortgage, related documents, if applicable, and any legal fees tied to financing. So understanding these responsibilities just helps avoid confusion during the closing. Clause 17, Residency. So this clause comes into play if the seller is a non-resident of Canada. So in such cases, the buyer may be required to withhold a portion of the purchase price to cover potential capital gains taxes that are going to be owed by the seller. So to prevent this, the seller must provide a clearance certificate from the Canada Revenue Agency, proving that their taxes have been paid. If the seller fails to provide this certificate, the buyer is legally obligated to withhold the required amount and remit it to the CRA. To avoid being stuck with this responsibility for your buyer, the buyer should always request a clearance certificate for closing. Ensuring this document is provided up front will protect the buyer from unexpected tax liabilities. Moving on, Clause 18, Adjustments. So at closing, certain costs associated with the property, like property taxes, condo fees, hydro bills, rent, are divided between both properties. Say it closes in the middle of the month, so this ensures that the buyer only pays for his half and the seller is going to pay for his half for the day of closing. So once he takes possession, the adjustments are calculated so that each party is responsible for their own portion of the cost up to the closing date. It's just a fair way to handle the ongoing expenses. Next, Clause 19, Property Assessment. So this clause just states that the property assessment can change over time, and with that, property taxes go up, they never go down. The buyer acknowledges that the property taxes rise after the sale. If they do, neither the seller nor the real estate agent is going to be responsible for paying the difference. The buyer needs to be aware that they may have to adjust their budget for potential future tax increases. So now let's look at Clause 20, Time Limits. This section is crucial because it outlines the deadlines that must be strictly adhered to. So like we were talking about the irrevocable earlier, these deadlines include things like delivering of deposits, completing of inspections, and closing of the sale. If either party misses the deadlines, the deal could fall apart. If either party needs an extension, they must get written approval, and it must be from both sides. Strict adherence to these deadlines keeps things on track and ensures a smooth transaction. So if you miss one of these deadlines, you're usually going to kill the deal. And both people have to agree if you need to extend it. So don't expect that just because you need an extra couple of days that the other side will agree. They could just let the deal fall. Clause 21, Tender. So this just ensures that both the buyer and seller are ready and able to complete the transaction on closing day. The buyer must have the funds available to them, and the seller must provide the property's title and the keys. If one party fails to meet these obligations, the other party can sue for damages or force the transaction to proceed. It ensures both parties are committed and prepared. Clause 22, Family Law Act. It's important if the seller is married. Even if the seller's spouse is not on title of the property, the spouse may still have legal rights to the property. So this clause ensures that the seller's spouse is informed and consents to the sale if necessary. If spousal consent is required, it helps prevent any legal disputes or challenges to the sale of the property after closing. Clause 23, U-fee. U-fee is about urea formaldehyde foam insulation, a banned insulation material that can result in toxic formaldehyde gas. The seller guarantees that they have not installed any U-fee in the property. If the installation is found after the sale, the seller could be held liable for misrepresentation. However, it's still important for the buyer to conduct their own inspections to ensure that the property is free from U-fee or other potential hazards. Clause 24, legal accounting and environmental advice. So this is just protecting the real estate agents by stating that they are not qualified to offer legal, tax, or environmental advice. If the buyer has any concerns regarding legal, tax, or environmental hazards like soil contamination, they're advised to hire professionals for this type of advice. This ensures that both the agent and the client understand their limitations and responsibilities in the transaction. Clause 25, consumer reports. This just informs the buyer that the seller or lender may run credit checks as part of the transaction, especially if the buyer is assuming an existing mortgage or entering into a rent-to-own agreement. The buyer should be prepared for this and highlights the importance of maintaining good credit history. Clause 26, agreement in writing. So this makes it clear that if any changes or additions are made to the agreement, like handwritten conditions or amendments, that they will override the standard pre-written clauses. It ensures that any negotiated terms are legally binding and no changes can be made unless they're in writing and agreed upon by both parties. 27, electronic signatures. So this one's just confirming that electronic signatures are legally binding, and it speeds up the process of signing documents, especially for out-of-town buyers and sellers. This ease of signing electronically makes it easier to complete transactions remotely without requiring a physical presence. Clause 28, time and date. So this one's just specifying that all the times and dates in this agreement are based on the location of the property, not the buyer or seller's location. So it's crucial because it ensures everyone is working with the same time zone, preventing confusion over deadlines and closing dates. Finally, Clause 29, successors and assigners. So this ensures that the agreement remains binding even if one of the parties passes away before the transaction is completed. In such cases, the deceased party's heirs, executors, or legal representatives are obligated to fulfill the terms of this agreement, and this prevents the deal from falling apart due to unforeseen circumstances and ensures a smooth transaction. Now let's take a look at the final sections of the document. After all the clauses, the buyer and seller must sign the agreement in the presence of a witness. When you're doing it remotely with a DocuSign or whatever, it's automatic for you. The application is your witness, but if you're signing it by hand, you need the witness. The spousal consent section right below that. So spousal consent ensures that the seller's spouse agrees to the sale of the property if required. So that's where they would sign off. The confirmation of acceptance section here is the exact time and date the agreement was finalized. So that'll be signed by the last person accepting all of the conditions and changes. So we're sending it back to the seller after a bunch of changes. They're saying, yeah, they agree. So they would be signing the confirmation of acceptance. Information of brokerages. So this section just provides details about the real estate agents, brokerages involved, and the acknowledgement section confirms that both parties have received a signed copy of the agreement. Next, we have Schedule A. So Schedule A, which was going to outline how the buyer will pay the balance of the purchase price, like I was mentioning above, and will include terms and conditions related to firming up the agreement unless the agreement is unconditional. So important conditions to consider. Here are some conditions to consider for your Appendix A. Home inspections. So home inspections, this is going to allow the buyer to have a professional home inspector to assess the property so they can assess the condition of what they're purchasing. You should be specific about the scope of inspection. So if it's structural, mechanical, environmental, and the timeline for the completion. Avoid vague language like satisfactory inspection, as it can lead to disputes. Instead, specify that inspections must reveal no major defects or issues exceeding a certain amount, say $5,000. That way it just shows your commitment to the deal. It might be look better than someone who just has that as the buyer's discretion. Financing condition. This ensures that the buyer can secure a mortgage, and again, be specific: loan amount, interest rate, term of length, and this will just get rid of any uncertainty. Another one to consider is sale of the buyer's current property. So some people have to sell their house before they can purchase. So this would have conditional on the sale of their current property, and to be specific about what's considered a sale. If it's a firm offer with no conditions, the timeline, 30 days, 60 days, how long do you have to sell your property? Insurance condition, just ensuring that the buyer of the property can obtain home insurance on the property, because you can't get a loan if you can't get house insurance. So that's usually one of the conditions that you'll see in a residential purchase of sale. Things to avoid in the Schedule A: using one condition for multiple purposes. So for an example, using home inspection condition to also assess zoning issues in the background or environmental concerns can create problems. If the buyer backs out citing the inspections, but actually the concern was about zoning, the seller could argue that the buyer acted in bad faith. Courts expect parties to act in good faith when fulfilling their conditions. So if the buyer fails to fulfill a condition for reason unrelated to the stated purpose, they could be held liable for breaching the agreement. So vague and overly broad language, so avoid phrases like subject to buyer's satisfaction without clear criteria. This leaves room for interpretation and disputes. For example, if a buyer claims they are unsatisfied with the inspection but can't provide evidence of this significant defects, seller may challenge them with the decision in court, saying, well, they weren't acting in good faith. Unrealistic timelines, so avoid setting overly tight deadlines for conditions. So 24 hours, say, for a home inspection. This can make it impossible to fulfill the condition properly and may be seen as acting in bad faith. The importance of good faith. So good faith is a legal principle that requires both parties to act honestly and fairly while fulfilling conditions. So here's one example of a court dispute that happened. So the issue would have been the buyer backed out of the deal citing financing conditions, but evidently showed that they had actually found another property that they preferred, and they just used the financing condition to back out. So the court's ruling for this was the court found that the buyer acted in bad faith by using financing conditions as a pretext to back out of the deal. The buyer was ordered to pay the damages to the seller for breaching the agreement. So using conditions dishonestly to back out of a deal can lead to legal liability for yourself. So just watch out and just always acting in good faith. So here's another one. The seller failed to disclose that the property was subject to a pending expropriation by the city. The buyer discovered this after the agreement was signed and sued for misrepresentation. The court ruled that in favor of the buyer, stating that the seller had a duty to disclose the material facts that could affect the property's value for use. Takeaways: the seller must act in good faith by disclosing all material facts about the property. Moving on, Schedule B. So Schedule B is often attached to the agreement. Schedule B is typically used for additional terms, conditions, or special clauses that are specific to the transaction. It's just really an extension of the Schedule A. For example, it might include details about repairs to be completed before closing, specific inclusions or exclusions from the sale, or any other negotiated terms that don't fit into the standard clauses. Both parties must review the initial Schedule B to confirm they agree to these terms. Both parties must review and initial the Schedule B to confirm they agree to these additional terms. And that's it. We've covered clauses 15 to 29 and the final sections of the APS Form 100 Agreement of Purchase and Sale, including a Schedule A and a Schedule B. Understanding these clauses is essential for anyone buying or selling a property in Ontario. So if you have any questions or need any further clarification, feel free to leave me a comment below. Don't forget to like and share. Making real estate great again, one home purchase at a time. Thank you.